Simon from matchesfashion.com. Welcome to SHOWstudio.
Hello.
How are you?
Good, thank you.
We're here to talk about London Collections Men, obviously to time with the wonderful SHOWstudio matchesfashion.com panel that we did. I want to start by picking your brains a little bit about London menswear, because people say that menswear in Britain is really having a moment, sort of right now. Do you think that London Collections Men is responsible for that?
Well, I'm not sure that it's entirely responsible for the biggest, it's definitely playing a role in it, and I think it also reflects what's going on in menswear in general, because obviously for it to be so successful there has to be a thirst for it in the first place, and obviously with Man, that was the original one-day event, which this has grown out of. The buzz was there, and obviously the British Fashion Council realised that there was enough designers in London to kind of develop the one-day thing into 3 days. So, and then that has a knock-on effect, doesn't it, across menswear in general, because obviously fashion shows are not seen by lots of people in the flesh, but they're becoming much more widely available and more visible. So I suppose the answer to the question is that British men are just generally more aware of fashion than they've ever been before, and that obviously does tie back to the shows in London.
It's interesting, sort of to jump ahead a bit about something we were talking about before we went live, this idea of sort of British men being more sort of aware of fashion, because actually London's always had a really interesting menswear history, and if you look at it as a city, even compared to sort of Milan or Paris, it's very interesting that we just had this one day that you mentioned, because London has such a rich history. That must be, as someone who's worked as, as a journalist, that must be so exciting to you to be reporting in a city that has this amazing heritage, punk mods. Absolutely,
and also I remember when I first started reporting on fashion shows, and menswear was always second fiddle to women's, and it's taken quite a long time for it to become seen in the same kinds of comparisons, and so that's been super exciting, I think, and also I think what happened with London Collections was the first season, everyone was like, is this going to work?
Yeah, is it going to take
like 3 whole days of men's fashion? Is there enough? And actually what's happened is the schedule is absolutely rammed, nearly as busy as the women's, if not, and it's I think surpassed everybody's expectations of the interest, the buzz of it, the people that are showing as part of it. So, I think we're really lucky in London that we do have all that backstory and the music and the culture of London as well, which is really important, I think, when you talk about things like punk and all of those different subcultures. But yeah, I think it's the way in which London has that kind of brilliant balance between, you've got Savile Row, but then you've also got St Martin's.
Yeah.
And so that's probably a big part of the success of London Collections, I guess, is that one minute you're seeing a man in a skirt, and the next minute you're seeing a man in a 3-piece suit with a pocket square. And that's kind of, I think, why menswear is so exciting in London. It's that tension. And that's probably been there in various ways for a long time, I guess.
Do you think, it's interesting to talk, because we're talking in a very sort of London-centric way, but do you think that all British men have felt the effects of having the London Collections?
Well, I think because menswear has got much more visible in culture generally, then yes, I think it probably has. And I think that the internet has obviously opened up a massive avenue for people to explore men's fashion, and I think that's been hugely impactful in terms of menswear becoming more comparable to women's, and whether that's through live streaming of shows or blogs or street style, social media, and then obviously sites like matchesfashion.com having editorial which specifically speaks to men and
I guess translates it to men.
And sort of unites the products with the designers, and then has a kind of like offers tips and kind of puts it into a sort of context. So yeah, I think that even if you're saying it's called London Men's Collection, it's about British fashion generally, and I think it has got a wide reach in terms of the bigger story about men's fashion.
It's interesting, I guess, when we're talking about that bigger story, because it feels to me like for perhaps some years, fashion is a bit of a taboo for men. You know, people, they don't like to be openly very interested in fashion. You know, not in the same way, perhaps that it's much more. It's much more expected for women to go shopping, to care about fashion. Do you think that that taboo's completely broken down? Is it fine for men to care about fashion, to care about style now?
I mean, I think there's a bit of a balance, because on the one hand, I think lots of men are still scared of the word fashion, and
they're more comfortable with style.
Yes, exactly. And yet, on the other hand, you know, we are seeing catwalk pieces which ordinarily would have been reserved for a magazine shoot are selling. So it's simply, the fact is that men are interested in fashion. They are buying more fashion than they ever have before. I think there's like a crazy statistic, like 9.9 billion has been brought to the economy by in the London economy from men's fashion.
Yeah, it's amazing. So
yeah, I think they are. Whether or not they say it's fashion, I don't know. But I think the taboo is breaking down. I think I come from that era of GQ magazine and David Beckham and grooming and all those things that, you know, that now mean that I don't think, oh, that's weird to buy a moisturiser. You know, like, and obviously as time goes on, the generation of men that are coming through now, they have even less hang-ups, because it's all over social media, or you know, they're looking at street style blogs and they can see what the editor of GQ wears. Exactly. So it's even more kind of connected and acceptable. I mean, obviously, there will always be, I guess, men who it's just not for them. But I think the idea that men can be fashion conscious is certainly accepted now in a way that it probably wasn't even 5 years ago.
Yeah, definitely. And beyond, I guess, the idea of it being acceptable, there's also, do you think we're seeing that reflected in the clothes? You know, men are dressing in a more adventurous way. Do you notice that, especially at matchesfashion.com, the kind of pieces or editorials, I guess, that your user is interested in, your shopper's interested in? Is it slightly more adventurous pieces? You know, whether that's print or whether that's, you know, the it knit that we've talked about.
Well, I think it's really, I mean, I think one of the really interesting things about London is that obviously the women's London Fashion Week shows has always been really famous for print and colour, and I think that has transferred over into menswear quite a lot, with designers like Jonathan Saunders, Richard Nicol, Aggie and Sam. And I think that actually the people shopping on the internet has meant that colourful things pop out more on the screen, and seeing those kinds of designers use more colour in their collections has definitely meant that I think men have branched out. I think, and I think that's not just about catwalk shows either. I think that's had an effect on the high street too. So yeah, I definitely think the last few years we've seen men embracing colour and print in a much more exuberant way, but also, you know, but also not necessarily like bonkers head to toe colour, but like, you know, a jazzy pocket square or a pair of colourful socks, or even like, you know, I think that rise of like trainers, that's a lot to do with colour. So yeah, I think there's definitely a kind of thirst for that, slightly more interesting fashion, and we definitely see that with the collections that we buy, you know, and we have JW Anderson, who, you know, isn't exactly your shirt and a suit kind of designer. And I think what's really nice about what's happening in men's fashion is it feels like there's room for everybody.
Lots of different voices, for sure.
And that goes, I think, in both senses. Like, it's great for the designers because it means that we can have, on the same Fashion Week schedule, you can have Richard James and you can have JW Anderson, but it's also great for men because there's just much more choice. Yeah,
no, definitely. You mentioned some of the designers that matchesfashion.com stock, because you have a great deal, but we had 4 different London men's brands with us for our amazing panel. We had Jonathan Saunders, Mark Hare, Oliver Spencer and Aggie and Sam. What makes all of them so strong? Because they're all designers that are stocked at matchesfashion.com. That's a big question because there's 4 of them to work through. But
I mean, Aggie and Sam, I think, have just burst onto the scene. And, you know, I think there's a real fondness for them in the fashion industry, from Paul Smith through to the buyers. And I think it's because they, in a way, unite 2 really key London things, which is a quirky, printy thing with tailoring and shirting and all those sorts of things that men are going to buy. And they're obviously a fledgling brand, and they need to do jazzy, fun things on the catwalk. But when you break that down, there's shirts with nice prints on them. It's not always, you know, it's not necessarily designed to be worn head to toe like mallard ducks from here to there, you know. And they know that too. They're very bright in that way. And then Jonathan is obviously just someone who is so incredibly clever at using colour. And
well, he's a colourist,
yeah,
just as much as a designer, isn't he? He's fantastic.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, also just the way that he puts textures together. And I think that for me, he's one of those designers who has been incredibly clever in that he's presented clothes for men that are interesting and colourful and textured, but they're not difficult necessarily to wear. No, and you can slot them into the rest of your wardrobe. So, you know, and also he's been really clever about how he's presented those clothes. Like, he hasn't done some big wham bam show thing. He's been much more, he's developed that menswear line really cleverly. It started with jumpers and then sort of evolved. So, yeah, I'm a big fan of his. Oliver Spencer, I think, has been very clever too, because he's designing clothes for men that are just great wardrobe things. Like, they just work. And, you know, there's always going to be there's always going to be room for designers that can pull together clothes that just are hard working. Yeah. Like, you know, whether it's a blues on jacket or whether it's just, you know, a pair of great chinos, he's really clever at like working out what the look is of the moment and making that work for lots of people.
And I guess for a long time he said that on our panels, where he likes this idea of seeing a bloke wearing one of his pieces from however many years ago. You know, it's good. I think hardworking is a really great word for him. You know, it's not seasonal in the same way.
No, and it also just slots in. You know, and you need those clothes that just work. And
then tell me about Mark Hare, because Mr. Hare accessories
Mr.
now.
Hare. Well, I mean, I think that's another really great thing about London Collections, is that, you know, it gives a voice to more than just catwalk designers. For sure. And for all the designers that are on the schedule, there are other things going on around it, like shoe presentations and whatever. And I think Mr. Hare has been super clever in that his shoes are just sexy, aren't they? They're just kind of like the sorts of things you just would want to wear to a party. I mean, obviously he does other things, but for me that's what I think of. I think of like a tassel loafer and a paint and like going dancing. It's like, you know, and it sort of slots in with that kind of, you know, dressier look for daytime. So you might put those on with a pair of old jeans, and I don't know, there's just something, everything about what he does makes the rest of your outfit feel a bit more special somehow, I think.
Off the back of what makes all of those London designers so strong, we kind of touched on this a little bit at the start, but I'd like to unpick it a bit more, is this idea of what it means to be, you know, a British designer. And this, we often talk about London style and Britishness, and I think all of those designers encapsulate that in their own different way. Maybe it's through, you mentioned with Aggie and Sam, you know, getting that great balance between those two heritages that we discussed. But what does it mean to be British, to be a British designer? Is there anything that encapsulates that?
Well, I think obviously you soak up all that atmosphere that London has, whether it's art galleries and, you know, Dalston or whatever it is. But I think it's about just pushing forward ideas but balancing them, and then and just sucking up loads of stuff, like, you know, and being able to sort of take something and mix it. I think it's a lot about the mixing. And being able to sort of drop a cultural reference. And I think we do that really well. You know, whenever you talk to the designers after shows, they've always got a story to tell you. I think there's a lot of that goes into British fashion. You know, it's not just a dress. It's got a, you know, it's got a story of where it came from, and it's the same with men's. You know, you always, I mean, it's probably my favourite thing about Fashion Week is when you go backstage and you get the designer and they start telling you
that
some amazing story. I think what was Jonathan Anderson talking about last time? It was something to do with architecture and like necklines, and you know, and you're just like, you know, I think that's a big part of the Britishness thing. It's just telling a really good story and just sucking up all that cultural stuff that sort of, I guess, we sort of forget about sometimes.
God, you made me really excited for London collections now. Simon, thank you
backstage.
so much. Yeah, no, I can't wait.
It's all happening there.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.